Welcome back to Home Learning. The subject today is computer science and we're going to be looking at malware and software. To get us started, we're going to go over to Mr. Holton, who's going to explain a little bit about malware and spyware to you, and then you're going to complete some tasks followed by exam questions. Over to Mr. Holton.
System security then always piques everyone's interest this. So how can I attack and harm a computer and possibly do some harm to the people who are using those computers as well? And there's loads of different ways to do it. This video is going to focus on malware as well as spyware. We're going to go into that, and as always we're going to talk about how to attack computers but how to defend against those attacks as well. So the first term we're going to cover is malware. It's your catch-all term. So when we say malware, we usually mean one of three things. First thing we mean is viruses. Now you've probably heard of them. They are programs which are going to cause some sort of harm to your computer. It can vary in what they do. I mean, it can like corrupt your hard drive so you can't load up your computer anymore, which is obviously very bad, or it can just be incredibly annoying. So I had a virus once which every time you pressed the fourth key on your keyboard, so you do A, B, C, D, the computer would then beep, and that was incredibly annoying. I had that one. So they cause some sort of harm. And then you've got worms. They try to just replicate themselves as fast as possible, quickly filling up your hard drive so it's unusable. And if it's on a network, it will try to fill up your network with copies of itself as well. So that'll try and bring down your networking computer that way. And then you've got Trojans as well. These will install themselves on your computer. They might allow somebody access, unauthorized access to your computer, which then they can get access to all your files and things like that. Okay, so viruses, worms, Trojans, and malware. And we defend against all of them using, and this is a nice easy one to remember, anti-malware. Okay, you've obviously heard of antiviruses probably, but anti-malware just makes clear we're covering defense against worms and Trojans, because we don't typically say like anti-worm software, anti-Trojan software. It's just anti-malware for that. Second thing, spyware. So this is software installed on your computer which is sending information to somebody else without your knowledge. A bad one, a very bad one, is a keylogger, and this will record every single key press that you make and send it to someone else. So here's my keyboard, and if you imagine then I press this letter B here, the fact that I've sent that letter B gets sent to this baddie over here, and you can tell that he's a baddie because he is wearing a top hat. And the problem, you might think that's not too much of an issue, he just knows to press letter B, but if you're on a website and you type in your username and password, all of a sudden he's got all that information, and he can go onto the same website, he'll know which one because he's got all the key presses that you press to get in there, and then be able to log in using your username and password. So that's keyloggers. Another example is adware. Adware will send information to third parties, so companies, about maybe what websites you're browsing, what kind of things you like to do with your time on the computer, but critically it will do it without your knowledge, so without your consent, which is illegal. That can all be combated against this type of spyware, both types of spyware, using anti-spyware. So these are two very easy terms to remember. You've got anti-malware to defend against malware, and you've got anti-spyware to defend against spyware. More attacks in future videos.
So now it's time for you to complete your first task on malware and spyware. In this task, you're going to be asked to drag and drop some statements into the correct types of malware, and then you're going to use the web to do a bit of research into a few famous kind of malware releases. So I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to complete the tasks, and then we will look back at the tasks and review them. Off you go. So that is your time up, and we're going to go over to Mr. Barnes to review the answers.
Okay then, so let's have a little look at this activity that involved dragging and dropping different statements under the correct type of malware. So we've got viruses, worms and Trojan horses. So the first thing, let's have a look. Spreads by copying itself and attaching to files and people pass it on. Well, that is a virus, and the most common form of passing them on is using email attachments. Okay, the next one, let's go often disguised as legitimate software. That is Trojan horses, and you mostly see that type of thing if you're trying to download just some sort of like small software off the internet that's not massively well known. It might be like a file conversion program or something like that. It looks like proper software, but it's disguised within it. Does not alter files. Well, that's a virus. A virus doesn't alter files. It may delete files, it may rename them, but it doesn't. It might lock you out of them, but it doesn't alter them. Activated by the user opening the file. Well, that is also viruses. As I mentioned, quite often what happens is they're sent as attachments. People have to download those attachments and then run them. We've got spreads by self-replicating. Well, that's worms, and that's why worms are particularly deadly, because they don't need the user to replicate. They can self-replicate and then send on to other devices. We've got is not self-replicating. Well, that is a Trojan horse. The only way that replicates is by the user doing so. We've got can allow the control of system and its key functions. Well, that's worms, and that normally happens through exploiting weaknesses. So then we've got examples. So we've got the oxtrojan.gen. Well, that is clearly a Trojan. We've got Blaster, which is a worm. I'm going to look at these in a second. And we've got the I Love You virus. So the I Love You virus also has a little worm tendencies in it with how it works as well. So let's have a look at these. So hopefully you've done a bit of research and tried to find out what these malware examples did or could do. So the Blaster exploited flaws in programming code, and then that allowed, when executed, to cause a system reboot every 60 seconds. which was very, very frustrating. And for some cases, it created an empty welcome screen. So instead of the nice welcome screen when it loads up, you've got an empty welcome screen. So it didn't do too much damage, but it was just really, really frustrating until a patch was released. And I remember having that one myself, and it was really, really frustrating. The I Love You virus, well, this is a virus, but it came in the form of an email with an attachment. The attachment was the virus, and when run, it renamed the file extensions of lots of files and caused the system to not boot because it changed all the file extensions. So in this one, there was the virus element was the attachment itself, but it came in the form of an email attachment, and this was like almost the worm part where it then sent to everyone in your address book. So that was like really, really frustrating. And then finally, we've got OS X Trojan Gen. Now this only affected Mac computers, hence OS X. And what this did was just a load of really frustrating things. So it could activate your camera or microphone, log your keystrokes, which meant it could, access what you're typing in. So if you're logging into a website with passwords and stuff, track your location with Find My Mac. It could copy and delete files. It could still save passwords. And there was a whole host of other things it could do as well, but they were just some of them. So what we've got there is we've got lots and lots of sort of, they're all categorized as malware, but there's different types of malware, and viruses, worms and Trojan horses are just some of them, and these are some examples. By all means, have some research and have a little bit of a look in more detail at some of the most deadly ones, because they're quite an interesting read about what they did and how they worked.
So now you've had the information from Mr. Holton and you've completed a task reviewed by Mr. Barnes. You're now going to attempt some exam questions. You've got 10 minutes, give it your best shot, off you go. So finally, we're going to go over to Mr. Barnes, who'll review those exam questions. Please make sure you amend your answers. Over to Mr. Barnes.
Okay, so let's have a look at these couple of questions that you should have just answered. So we've got a doctor's surgery stores hundreds of patients' details on its computer network. The surgery is concerned about the security of its patient-sensitive medical data. Question A. Staff are already required to use strong passwords to protect systems. Explain, with reference to system security, a method that could be used to prevent malicious software ending up on the system. So, this is about prevention, not necessarily identification of a threat, although it's useful to know what the threat is to know what the prevention is. So, my first thoughts are that they could end up with some kind of malware, virus, worm, or something along those lines on the device. Now, if that's in mind, what we need to do here is we need to identify one prevention method and then explain what it does to prevent it. So I'm going to write very simply anti-malware software. There's my identification mark, and then I'm going to talk about what it actually does. This will remove malware such as viruses from causing harm to the system. Okay, so let's have a look at the mark scheme for the first question. Okay, so we've got here, you've got 1 mark for anti-malware software, perfect, so let's award that mark. And you get 1 mark for removing viruses or spyware from infecting the system. So I said it will remove malware such as viruses from causing harm to the system. So there is my second marks for 2 marks. Now what it does say here, it's really important that it can accept antivirus software, anti-spyware software, but we are not allowed to name specific software like Norton or AVG. That is not allowed, so you can't name branded software. Okay. So let's have a look at the second question. So it says identify 3 ways malicious software could end up on a network. So what are the different ways we could end up with malicious software on the network? Well, for me, the first and most obvious one is people downloading files that contain viruses. The next one would be people using memory sticks to transport data that contains malware. And for me, I think that the other obvious one is people sharing files with you that contain malware. Malware. Okay, so let's just move this up a little bit so we can get the mark scheme on. So here we've got first mark, downloading files that contain viruses. I've got my second bullet point here, downloading infected files from the internet. 1 mark. Using memory sticks to transport data that contains malware. Second mark. And sharing files with you that contain malware is the other mark. And we've got 3 marks there. And there we have it, full mark.
And that's it for malware and spyware. Please stay tuned for the next lesson.